To the Museum of Discovery and Science with a special edition of our Distinguished Speaker Series. We're going to be talking about one of the most historical hurricane seasons in memory. 2020, among other things, was a land-breaking year for hurricanes. Over a dozen landfalling storms just in the United States alone, and more storms on record and the second highest number of hurricanes on record. So many that we ran out of names. I can remember one year in 2005 when towards the end of hurricane season, we got to like Hurricane Alpha and Hurricane Beta, and we said, wow, that's nuts. And this year we breezed through the Greek alphabet, I feel like, with a couple weeks to spare. So a lot to catch up on, and we have a special guest, Dr. Erik Salna, director of the Extreme Events Institute and International Hurricane Research Center at Florida International University, and a good friend of the museum, who you might recognize from our annual Eye of the Storm event and our Eye of the Storm video series that we produced this spring. We're going to be hearing from Erik in just a minute, but just a few ground rules before we get started. Everybody's microphone is going to be muted for the duration of the event, aside from Erik and myself. Just to keep it one flowing conversation, not have too many interruptions. Feel free to have your cameras on or off to your comfort level, but feel free to type any questions you have in the chat. And this will allow you at any point during the event, during the presentation, if Erik's talking about something that you'd like to know more about, just put your questions in the chat. We're going to save them for later and save time at the end for a good discussion. So remember to keep those in the chat. We will get to them at the end. And we're going to be talking to Erik Salna now. Erik Salna is a friend of the museum, the host of our annual Eye of the Storm event, going back several years now, and helped us produce a very great video series, which I'll be linking in the chat in just a moment. And he's here to talk about a very wild hurricane season. So Erik, thank you for joining us this evening. And yeah, tell us about this wild hurricane season we had this year.
Sure, will do, Brady. Thank you very much. How do you hear me? Loud and clear?
Sounds good.
All right. Well, let's, as you said, we're going to cover a lot of information tonight with regards to the last hurricane season, hurricane research, hurricane education, STEM education. So again, we're going to encourage everyone, if questions come to mind, go ahead and put them in the chat, and then we'll answer as many of those as we can in this program. And during the program itself, I'm going to be asking all of you just a couple of questions, and thinking in terms of everyone out there, not just in South Florida, but in other locations around the country. And if we have some moms and dads and with kids out there, I'm going to focus on you as well. So we're going to cover a lot of ground and a lot of great information. I hope to have a little fun too. So with that in mind, Brady, I'm going to hit this share screen button and see if we can get this all started. Okay, how's that look, Brady? Look full screen on my graphic?
Looks good to me.
All right. So again, I want to thank you and thank the entire team at the Museum of Discovery and Science in Fort Lauderdale for this opportunity for me to now have the honor to be a part of this distinguished speaker series. And I really do appreciate the opportunity, and thank you all very, very much. And as Brady, you already said, we're going to be talking about the historical hurricane season and everything that went along with that. So, all right, so we'll go ahead and get started on that. I'm going to, first of all, just show you my contact information real quick at the top here. I'll show this again at the end. But again, I'm Erik Salna, Associate Director of Education and Outreach at the Extreme Events Institute and the International Hurricane Research Center at Florida International University in Miami. So there's my email address and my phone number, and you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter as well. All right, I'm showing a very old picture here, and that's my old family picture. I grew up in a I live in Miami now, but I grew up in a far, far northern land called Illinois and near Chicago, and where they had 4 seasons of weather. And you could see that was me when I was just a little kid. And the reason I'm showing that picture is because there seems to be a common denominator with people who get interested in weather, and it happens at an early age. And for me, it started with a huge lightning bolt that hit just outside my bedroom window, actually scared me to death. But what was interesting, how that fear grew into a curiosity and then eventually into a passion to want to learn about the weather. And that passion is in your heart, and you combine that with hard work, and you can make that dream come true. So the first message right at the top here is for all of us, and for any kids out there listening, whatever it is, your passion in your heart, make it come true. You can with hard work, study hard, and maybe one day you could be a distinguished speaker as well in a series like this at your local science museum, or even here at Mott's. Wouldn't that be cool? All right, a couple of other influences besides weather. Growing up, I just want to let you know, I'm a little bit older. And for me, when I was in grade school, believe it or not, we used to watch the launch of the rockets from Kennedy Space Center. And they used to wheel in those old black and white television sets. Yeah, before there was color. And they brought them in the classroom, and we used to watch the rocket launches. And it was an amazing influence on all of us as kids, because thinking to ourselves, we're flying to the moon. How is that possible? That seems impossible. But we did it. And imagine the technology we had back in the 1960s when we finally landed on the moon in 1969, and we made that dream come true. So science, that was a big influence on me growing up. And through that space program, it did influence a lot of kids to get into science careers. And what's cool is we're now going to go back to the moon, and we're actually going to go on to Mars as well. And one other influence I had growing up was, every year annually they show The Wizard of Oz. And for me, in the springtime, as the spring season started heating up in the Midwest and we would start to get severe weather, we would see The Wizard of Oz and see that tornado. And that was always fascinating to me, and how, that tornado and what it can do. And of course, that whole movie and the whole script of that movie. And what's fascinating too, is it's a really good research read, if you will, to learn how did they create that tornado in The Wizard of Oz without special effects. Think about that. It's really interesting. Okay, all right, Brady. So here's one of my first general questions for the audience. What is the science of weather? What is that called? And you could monitor chat for me, Brady, see if anyone can come up with that answer pretty quick. Let's see, I'll give it a few seconds.
Okay. Got a few people chiming in already with what I would call the correct answer to this trivia question.
And it is?
Meteorology.
All right, there you go. So for any kids that are watching and are interested in weather, yes, if you get into the science of weather, that's called meteorology. And to be a meteorologist, well, it meant I had to take a lot of math classes. It meant I had to take a lot of science classes. And those were not also easy. In fact, a lot of my math classes were pretty hard. And it discouraged me. And it almost made me want to quit. But remember my passion and what my dream was? Well, I wasn't going to quit. I was going to work hard, study hard, get extra help from mom and dad or my teachers or mentors, and make it happen and make it become a reality. And it did. I got through all the math and became a meteorologist. And it's a STEM career. And we know STEM is science, technology, engineering, and math. And meteorology is certainly one of those really cool STEM careers to get involved with. And for me, it meant looking at the Earth and weather systems all around the planet and learning about the clouds and warm fronts and cold fronts and thunderstorms and tornadoes and even hurricanes. And so for part of my career, I was in television, full-time television. That's how I was communicating my passion for weather. And then I left full-time television to communicate my passion more into weather education and research, and now at Florida International University. And at FIU, what we do is a lot of hurricane-related research having to do with the damage cost of a hurricane hitting an area or storm surge affecting a coastline. And we are also what's called a Weather Ready Nation ambassador. So I'm just putting this plug in there for all of you listening. Any organization or group or museum or business can become a Weather Ready Nation ambassador. And you get on the NOAA website and you can fill out their application. It's not very hard, but if you're doing things related to weather education and safety and mitigation, then you too can be an ambassador to help spread this kind of message. And also on our campus at Florida International University is this, look at this concrete building. That's the National Hurricane Center, co-located with what's called the National Weather Service. It's the Miami office together, and they have the responsibility, the National Weather Service and the National Hurricane Center, of forecasting our hurricanes every hurricane season. And a quick note, another collaboration project we had with the National Hurricane Center was creating a Spanish language hurricane website. There is the English version, the National Hurricane Center, nhc.gov, but then you can go to huracanes.fiu.edu to learn all about this preparedness information in Spanish. All right, now let's get to the 2020 hurricane season. Here's kind of a snapshot of all the storms. My goodness, it was just off the chart, as Brady already alluded to. And a quick question now for maybe some of the kids out there. When does the hurricane season start and when does it end? Brady will take just a few seconds to see if some people come up with those correct answers.
Okay, that's trivia question number 2. Let's put our answers in the chat. So we're asking for when it starts and when it ends.
And it's a longer season than many people even kind of think about or even realize.
Yep, and I got, again, a few correct answers in the chat. We are looking at June 1st to November 30th.
There you go, excellent. And if you add it up, that's 6 months. And I always ask the students in the class, how many months in a year? Well, there's 12. Well, 6 months of a hurricane season, that's half the year. And for many of us that live in the hurricane zone, we have to be ready and prepared for half the year. And boy, did we have to be prepared in 2020. Looking at the numbers, there's so many ways to slice and dice this mathematically in terms of statistics. But the biggest one, of course, is 30 named storms. The highest number we've ever seen before was 28 back in 2005. But it was off the chart in terms of how many storms and how many hurricanes and how many hurricane hunter flights into those storms. Just an amazing amount of just storms. And here are the names. As you mentioned already, Brady, we had to go to the Greek alphabet. And we had only done that one time before, and that was back in 2005. And I was hoping we would never see the Greek alphabet again. Unfortunately, we did, and that was this year. And we got deep into the Greek alphabet. It's only used when you run out of names, and we had the names from Arthur, Bertha, all the way down to Wilfred. And then we ran out, so we had to go to Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and so on, and got all the way to Iota. And finally, it stopped. And that's how far we got. And as far as the name game, there's 6 lists that we use. They get rotated. So this year's list, the Arthur list will get rotated and come back again in 6 years. And for the famous storms, if you will, they get retired to the Hurricane Hall of Fame and they never get used again. And there will be several names from this year's list that will not be used again. So looking at the numbers, named storms, hurricanes, and majors. An average season is 12, 6, and 3. Now look at 2020. The average is 12. We had 30. The average is 6 hurricanes. We had 13. The average is 3 majors. We had 6. And look what I put in the yellow on the bottom. Because I'm going to be answering, why was this hurricane season so busy? Why did it happen? Well, here's one of the first answers in yellow. We are we are in an active cycle that lasts 25 to 30 years, where there's many storms, and then there's 25 to 30 years where it drops down again, and there's fewer storms. Well, this active cycle started in 1995. So this falls in line from when, being in an active cycle. Here's the tracks. You can see so many tracks. And unfortunately, we see a lot of tracks that came into and towards the United States and affected the Gulf, the Caribbean, and affected states in the US. And look at this chart. This shows you in color how much area, geographical area, was affected by tropical storm force winds. That is a lot of real estate from Texas all the way up to Maine that had at least tropical storm force winds this season. And unfortunately, there was one state that had too many paths and found themselves in too many cones, and that was Louisiana. It wasn't Florida. Florida, we're the hurricane capital of the country. You would have thought we would have had several, but it was not Florida's year. It was other parts of the country, and certainly Louisiana. And so this cartoon came out. I don't know if you've seen this before, but there's Texas feeling sad and feeling compassionate for the state of Louisiana. And Louisiana's like, why us? Why does it have to be us? Well, that's what we were all thinking, right? All right, another answer as to why were there so many storms and affecting the United States? Here's the next answer. It's steering currents. And it's what's called the Bermuda High out in the center of the Atlantic. And it was strong. And depending on its position, that'll determine where storms will go. Well, it was strong. It had enough, the right strength and the right position to then keep those storms coming right towards the US. So here we have one of the earlier storms, Eta, that was affected the Central America. And the ingredients to create a hurricane. This is another answer. Why was it so busy? Well, like I call the ingredients of baking a cake. Well, it was an abundance this year. So we had a moist atmosphere. Certainly you need that moisture. We had area of low pressure. We had lots of those tropical waves coming from the African coastline. And I have what's called no wind shear. And no wind shear has to do with light winds at high altitude. Hurricanes don't like strong winds and jet stream winds. They want it nice and calm. There was no wind shear, and we had plenty of fuel, plenty of warm ocean water. So those were some of the ingredients, certainly in abundance. And then in addition to the 2020 recipe was, I have on the left side here, what's called La Nina. And out in the Pacific, we have what's called El Nino, and then it switches to La Nina. El Nino is when there's warm waters in the Pacific. La Nina is when the waters get cold. And when you have a La Nina, it opens the door for more hurricanes to form in the Atlantic. So it's interesting to see these connections from one ocean to the next. The Pacific, what happens there can affect what happens in the Atlantic with our hurricane season. I also have here low surface air pressures throughout the Caribbean and through the tropical areas where systems form all the way out to Africa. That was low surface air pressures were in abundance. And West African monsoon. They have that in West Africa, and that's when they have their rainy season, but it was very active in sending these tropical waves and impulses out into the Atlantic and into that bowling alley, if you will, of great ingredients to form storms. And they did form. And we saw many that got this full structure of what a hurricane looks like. Once it starts forming with the moisture, we have the spiral bands around it, and then that center of low pressure in the eye, which forms. So what are the weapons of a hurricane? Well, there's many. You can have storm surge, rip currents, tornadoes, inland flooding, and certainly strong wind. And strong wind is certainly what everyone thinks about when a storm is approaching. What's its category going to be? 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? We all know the higher the number, the stronger the storm. And wind is certainly something we need to protect ourselves from. But the other weapon, storm surge. Storm surge is all that water that starts to flood the coastline. And that's why then many people need to evacuate that might be in harm's way to that storm surge. And National Hurricane Center has been putting a lot of emphasis on storm surge, and several years ago came out with new terminology, storm surge watch and storm surge warning. There always has been hurricane watch and warning, but because they wanted to put an emphasis on storm surge, they came out with these watches and warnings so that it would make the public aware of the danger of floodwaters coming in off the ocean, storm surge. And of course, that inland flooding threat. We've seen many storms that slow down and drop tremendous amounts of rain. And so it's very dangerous. So you don't want to walk into that water, and you certainly don't want to drive into that water. And the National Weather Service says, when flooded, turn around, don't drown. So we want to be careful about those flood waters. Okay, so how is the hurricane forecast or the forecast cone created? And what does the cone show us? And what does it not show us? And I'm going to answer these questions, Brady. So first of all, the cone, how is it created? Well, there's a whole bunch of computer models. And these computer models take atmospheric observations, math and physics and those types of equations. And there's a different combination of those math and physics equations that are put in these various models, and they produce these tracks. And you may have seen this on television, and they give it the nickname the spaghetti models because you're seeing all these tracks. Well, they're trying to forecast where the storm is going to go. Now, we wish there was one model that was the absolute most accurate model to tell us where it's going to go. Well, then on TV, all you would see is just one skinny black line. Well, unfortunately, there's not one model that can most accurately predict exactly where the storm is going to go. So with the National Hurricane Center, the only thing they can do is then encompass those models and form a cone. And that's why we see a cone on television showing us the geographical region on where a storm might be. But I have here on my graphic saying the cone tells us geography, but it doesn't tell us about the hazards. It doesn't mean where the cone is, that that's exactly where all the hazards are going to be. It can certainly be outside of the cone, and that's an education process for all of us. So we need to go to the National Hurricane Center website or the National Weather Service, and they'll have a whole assortment of different graphics showing you where floodwaters might be, where the winds are going to be, when are the winds going to arrive, and where's the storm surge going to be, and so on. That's what we need to look at more specifically. And how can you get some of those graphics for your local community? Well, depending on where you live. For us here in Miami, for those specific graphics showing what the effect of a storm is going to be, we can go to the National Weather Service Miami office. Now, all of you outside of Florida, you have a local National Weather Service office. So you can go to your local National Weather Service office website to see those specific graphics and how the storm may affect your community. And here's just an example of what they can look like, specifically showing what the hazard threats are for each one of those weapons of the storm. Okay, does anyone fly into hurricanes? Yes or no? Brady, I guess I'll see if anyone out there wants to answer that one. Yes or no? Does anyone actually fly into a hurricane?
Seeing some yeses come in, seeing a no or two come in,
Okay.
and seeing a couple people specify hurricane hunters.
All
flying
right,
into hurricanes.
excellent. Well, I like the no answers, and this is what I mean by that. Why in the world would you fly into a hurricane? What are you, nuts? Well, guess what? we do fly into hurricanes, and absolutely that viewer was correct. They're called the hurricane hunters. And there's several of those hurricane hunters. NOAA has a fleet of planes. You can see them here, a G4 jet and a P3 aircraft. And then of course we have the Air Force Reserve pilots that fly C-130s. And the reason they go in is we got to get information about the storm, because once we know what's happening inside that storm and where exactly it's located and the pressure, that'll help us with those computer models that I just showed you. So they start flying towards the storm, and their goal is to get into the eye. And when they do, it's an amazing experience, as you can see from this picture here. You know, we nickname it the stadium effect. Think of yourself standing at the 50-yard line of a football stadium and looking all around, and these well-developed eyes from the most intense hurricanes have these eye walls. Now, in this eye, where they took this picture, the pilots and the crew, it was pretty smooth sailing. Calm, clear, even sunny. Well, see what's dead center in that image? The eye wall. They had to get through that eye wall to get to this eye. And let me tell you, that is not an easy flight. All of them have challenges. All of them have danger. And for any kids out there that have ever been on a roller coaster, well, think of a roller coaster times 10 in terms of the amount of turbulence that they feel. So they have all kinds of harnesses and seat belts on, holding them in their seat, because when they get into that eye wall, they are moving every which way until they get bounce out and get through that eye wall. If you ever talk to a hurricane hunter pilot or a member of a flight crew, their stories are amazing as well. Another amazing picture of an eye wall and what they see once they fly into it. And that's where they're dropping instruments to get data, and it's called a drop sign. So they're dropping this. It's an instrument that has a parachute. It comes out of the rear of the aircraft, and the whole purpose now is to measure. Now we want to get location, we want to get wind speed and direction, we want to get pressure, we want to get temperature, we want to get humidity. And all of this data then, once we get it, is fed right away directly from the aircraft to the National Hurricane Center at FIU in Miami and to Washington, D.C. for their computer models. And what's really cool is that they're also dropping drones. And this is a new way to get data, dropping drones, and now they're safer. And what we mean by that, now you don't have a flight crew and pilots involved. You just have a drone, and the drone can be flown into the most dangerous part of the storm at lowest levels. The hurricane hunters come in at about 10,000 feet. Well, the drones can go much lower, and that extra data can be very helpful. All right, so there's a bit about the hurricane season and how we get the data and how it's presented and how we create the cone. But I do want to mention one thing before moving forward. You know, everything I just talked about is all about hurricane science and education, but I know fully as a meteorologist that beyond all of that in the cone and the satellite pictures is that these are people's lives, homes, and businesses. I showed you the cone over Louisiana. We see the storm over Louisiana. But when you're on the ground in these communities, they're still recovering today. So I just wanted to share a bit of encouragement, and for anyone that would have compassion and want to consider to maybe donate to some of the many great nonprofits that are still right now providing relief efforts. You know, the media goes away after the storm, after so many days and weeks, but their problems remain. So just wanted to mention that. And we still are thinking of them that have been affected as we move into this new year. Okay. All right. Here's another question, Brady. This one you would think would be kind of easy, but are there natural disasters occurring around the world? Yes or no? Let's see what folks think.
Okay, this is a pretty broad question.
Yes.
So feel free to throw any answer out there that you like. Seeing some yeses come through, saw a no early on.
Okay, well,
I guess this could maybe fall into a you know, right now or where or
right.
specifically, but
Well, there you
someone said
go.
everywhere. Someone, a couple of people said no.
And here, and Brady, and for all of you watching, my answer is no. Now you're probably wondering, no? What do you mean no? What do you mean there's no natural disasters occurring around the world? Sure there are. Well, no. And let me explain. Because there are no natural disasters. We've put two words together that incorrectly describe what's happening. Point number one, see how I call it natural hazards. Oh yes, we have natural hazards occurring around the world all the time. But they're not disasters. They're not a disaster until they interact with a community. They collide with our human, physical, and economic systems. And we have built around the United States and around the world cities and towns where natural hazards collide into it. And that's what a natural disaster is, but it's not, really doesn't happen until you have that collision. So we have those natural hazards. So point number three, the term puts too much blame on Mother Nature and not enough on where and how we build our communities. So we've created our own exposures and vulnerabilities. So as we look forward to more hurricane seasons and climate change issues and more extreme events, we have to combat this and do things differently. And that's what we talk about also at the Extreme Events Institute. So if you go to our webpage, on the homepage, we have this equation. And just to explain it for you, there's the left hand and the right hand side. The right hand side has H plus EX times V. H is the hazard, so let's say hurricane. EX is exposure, so how much buildings and people in harm's way. And V is the vulnerability of that community. How well is it going to be able to withstand that hazard? And that'll determine the left side. Will it just be an EM, an emergency, or a DR, disaster, or a CAT, a catastrophe? So it all depends on that exposure and vulnerability. And what our goal is, we're trying now, not only in the US, but worldwide, to have more emergencies and less disasters and certainly less catastrophes, fewer. So let's take an example. Well, here, let's talk about a Hurricane Irma, which hit here in South Florida in 2017. So there's your H. And from there, we go to, all right, how about our exposure? Well, exposure is how many people? Well, Florida's population has exploded since 1950. We all know that. And from that, we go to housing, another statistics. How many more homes and businesses and schools and hospitals we have all across Florida? So this is the exposure that keeps rising and rising and rising. So our vulnerability. The good news is for us is we know we get hurricanes. So we have some of the strongest building codes in the entire nation. But this picture shows an example of older construction built in earlier decades with older building codes. So the building in the middle was 2014, and you can see how it hung in there, right, with Irma. But look at the buildings on either side, built in the 1980s. They failed. And this picture is a snapshot of what is happening across the country. And our goal is to enhance our building codes across the nation. We know how to do it. We can build better and build stronger. So this is another topic for a career, and we call it wind engineering. Wind engineering now, learning how we can make our built environment, our cities and towns stronger to hurricane force winds. And the way we do it at FIU is called the wall of wind. And it's 12 giant fans where we can create up to Category 5 hurricane conditions. And that's been the picture you've been seeing behind me as well, where we build structures and we learn how we can now engineer them differently to make them stronger. So I'm going to show a video here. And Brady, this video it has no sound, it has subtitles, so I'm just going to talk over it. but this was a very interesting project we did, is a demonstration at the wall of wind to show how mitigation can work. So as I said, we can create up to Category 5 hurricane conditions, and not only with wind, but with water. So we had a media team come, and they said, we want to see something blown out the door. And we said, well, we get that, but we want to show you how to keep that building strong at the same time. And this is what we did. We built this structure, and it had two different sides. First, it had a strong side where we had metal shutters and roof tie downs. And then we also had what we called the weak side, where we didn't have any metal shutters or roof tie downs that hold down that roof. So we first hit the strong side with up to Category 4 winds and no failure. It hung in there and reinforced for less than $250. And look what we did. We then spun that building around the weak side, hit it with the same wind, and watch what happens. Catastrophic failure. Watch that roof. This is what happens with older construction and communities hit with hurricane force winds. Watch that hurricane debris. Imagine neighborhoods of homes blowing apart like that in all that flying debris. That roof went quite a ways before it stopped and hit what we call our concrete debris wall, 200 feet downwind. That's where the wall caught that roof. So it was a great demonstration. The media, they got what they wanted, Hollywood, something blown out the door. But we got what we wanted too, which was a teachable moment showing how we can be more resilient. And we're learning that at the FIU Wall of Wind. Now, what's really cool, Brady, you already mentioned the great relationship that we have with the Museum of Discovery and Science mods, a super duper relationship. And one of the things we did was, hey, let's create an exhibit of the Wall of Wind and put it in the museum. So now moms and dads and kids can build little houses and learn these same types of concepts. And this is a picture of it here. And it's lots of fun where you can take the different homes and the different shape of rooftops and then see what happens when you turn on the mini Wall of Wind at mods. And what happens when you have a structure, what we learn in wind engineering is that there's pressures, positive pressures and negative pressures that are acting as a force on that building. So I have three rooftops here. I have what's called a gable roof, a hip roof, and a flat roof. All right, Brady, another question for the audience. Which roof of those three, gable, hip, or flat, does the best in a hurricane wind? So that's my question to everyone listening tonight.
Let's test our knowledge of sustainable architecture out there. Seeing a lot of answers for hip.
All right, congratulations. Hip is correct because it's the most aerodynamic because it's sloping on all four sides, and that makes that roof more aerodynamic and therefore the best shape of a roof top for building construction in a hurricane area. Now, how do you keep that roof down? This is a picture showing those metal straps that are in our attics here in South Florida, but not everywhere across the country, that literally hold that roof in place. Another weak point is the garage door. And our garage doors need to be very strong here in Florida as well. And here's an example of one that's reinforced so that it will be able to withstand the wind, the pressures, and flying debris. Because this is what we're trying to protect ourselves from. These incredible pictures of flying debris, famous pictures now of 2x4s slicing right into a palm tree. So then the question comes up, well, we got to protect our windows. What's stronger, plywood or metal? Well, the answer is metal. So plywood is used. However, what the goal is to have people use other products that are stronger than plywood, because even plywood can fail, but metal certainly is much stronger. And look at this, we have to stop doing this. Everyone did this years ago, putting tape on windows. Well, that was old education. We have new education now, and it says tape does nothing, but we're still trying to get the word out. And one more thing that's kind of cool, if you're in a home before a storm hits, close all the interior doors. And that's one last thing you would do before the storm hits, to now strengthen it before a storm comes through your neighborhood. And what can we do to determine if our home will withstand a storm? Well, you can what's called get a wind mitigation inspection. And this is a way to gift yourself like a report card on your home. How strong is my home? In this report card, this wind inspection report will tell you what I can do moving forward to make my home more resilient to wind. And back to the National Hurricane Center on the FIU campus, again, noticing how did they build that structure? Concrete. The walls are this thick. National Hurricane Center is not going to blow away. Now, we're not saying all homes need to be built of concrete, but they were certainly built to be resilient, and we have ways to make it happen. And Lithicus, this is a famous picture showing wind mitigation in the upper Texas coast. And this homeowner was affected by a storm, originally Rita, and they didn't move away. They rebuilt Code Plus above the local code, and they withstood Hurricane Ike. So every dollar we spend on mitigation saves at least $6 in damage and cleanup. So it fiscally makes sense. Now, all of these topics I've talked about tonight all have to do with hurricane science, mitigation, and preparedness. And what's really cool, another great partnership we had with MODS this past spring and summer was we created a 12-part hurricane education video series. All of them are available to you. They're free. And this information, very important, as we've just been talking about. And if you go to the webpage, mods.org, Eye of the Storm, you'll see the complete lineup of all the videos. And they're all on YouTube that you can click on to learn about each and every one of these topics. And what I have here this evening is just a 2-minute teaser of what you'll see if you watch all 12 segments.
Hurricane season is here. We still have the hurricane hunters flying through us to get us the latest information. In collaboration with the Museum of Discovery and Science, FIU has partnered with many organizations to bring you Eye of the Storm, an educational series all about hurricane science, mitigation, and preparedness. We'll learn about hurricane research at FIU. How do we forecast hurricanes? What are the dangers of storm surge? And how we can prepare our families, homes, and businesses. We'll also get to see cool science experiments and mods. Eye of the Storm, sponsored by Florida International University's International Hurricane Research Center and the Florida Division of Emergency Management. Only on the MODS YouTube channel.
All right, and that was a video series last year because of COVID. Well, 2021 is going to be a better year, and we are all moving ahead. The video series will continue to be evergreen for all of us to continue to use for many years. But moving ahead, I just wanted to say that we're happy to say we're again partnered with MODS, and we're looking forward to the in-person event of Eye of the Storm on Saturday, May 15th. So we're certainly looking forward to that, where we're going to bring all of this content and all of the experts all come together in one day where you can meet the experts, meet the scientists, and talk about all of these topics with lots of neat demonstrations throughout the day and entertainment. It's a fun-filled day. All right, so I have a video of the Eye of the Storm 2 years ago, but at this point, I think, Brady, what we're going to do is we're going to just go to questions. If there's some questions we can answer, and we'll keep answering questions, and then we can show this video if there's time. But let's go ahead and go to questions that may have come up on the chat.
Sure, absolutely. So at this point, you can maybe stop sharing screen and then just for the discussion purpose.
Sure.
Let's keep things simple here. And yeah, feel free to, this is your opportunity. We have meteorologist and hurricane expert here with us. So all those questions that come up when the, when a hurricane's coming and we're all wondering what's going on, Eric got this is a great opportunity to get those customized questions named. You got a meteorologist and hurricane expert on demand. To start things off, I'm seeing a few questions already, and I have a few questions about that comment towards the end about closing all the doors in your house and what that does to air pressure. Because that's definitely something I've noticed is when I have all the windows open, like when I have all my windows open on a nice day like it's been recently, my doors will open and shut a lot easier.
Right.
And I'm kind of wondering how that plays out if I'm all boarded up on my windows for a hurricane.
Right.
Yeah, how does that affect air pressure inside my house, and why would closing your doors be advantageous to leaving them open inside the house?
A great question. And this is fairly new information that just came out in the last few years by the Institute of Building and Home Safety. They're the ones that came out with this new information that said that if you have a home, one of the last things you can do now, as far as dealing with pressure, is close all those interior doors. And in case there is a failure in one room, now you're going to keep the wind and water in one place as well. But they said, close those interior doors, the closets, the restrooms, the laundry room, or wherever those interior doors are. But I want to mention one thing we do not want to do, and that is open up any windows, just a little crack. Remember I showed you that picture of the tape? That was old education and everyone used to do it, where we say, don't use tape now, it does nothing. Well, we used to open up our windows before a tornado, and then that carried itself into hurricane land, thinking, well, if I equalize the pressure, then my house, if I don't open a window, my house will explode. Well, yes, there's differences of pressure outside and inside, but that's not what's causing the damage. The damage is the brute force of that flying debris that's smashing into your doors and windows. Then the wind gets in the house, and then there goes the roof. So the key thing is every single window and door has to be closed, and those exterior windows and doors have to be protected. So you can see, Brady, over the years, we've learned from the past, and this is how we're moving forward, and that's how we need to be mitigated for a storm.
Wow, yeah, that's great info, and something that I wouldn't have thought of, but I do have a vague memory as a young kid in South Florida of not only putting masking tape, not even duct tape, but masking tape over the windows. But definitely I had one or two relatives that would crack the window and hold on to that. So that's really good info that needs to be corrected. A couple more questions. This is from Michael and Libby. Is there a correlation between Enzo and the location and strength of the Bermuda High?
So the Bermuda High, in terms of that, is a big playmaker when we talk in terms of steering currents. And that can vary from week to week and month to month throughout the hurricane season, the intensity, the strength of that area of high pressure, and then its position. And as I said, with this past hurricane season, more often than not, its strength and position was conducive to making those tracks head towards the US, especially the Gulf of Mexico. So when you have also then the La Nina and El Nino, the changes of what's happening in the Pacific, what years are those going to coincide with all the right ingredients with the recipe, right? So it just turned out that we had the La Nina in conjunction with all those ingredients in the recipe all coming together in one year and made for an historical season. If it had been El Nino, then that would have had an effect to a point on how many storms we were going to have. And each and every year is different.
Very good. I have a question here from Elle, who wants to know, how often do tornadoes form during hurricanes?
Yeah, another great question. That's one of the weapons. We talked about the weapons of a hurricane, and that is certainly one of them. Now, typically the tornadoes where they will form is on the leading edge of an approaching hurricane. And it's on those outer edges, those outer spiral bands, where we'll have vigorous thunderstorms and develop. And that's where we can have tornadoes. And if we look at a hurricane and divide it up into 4 quadrants, you may have heard about, the left front quadrant or right front quadrant. That right front quadrant is the place historically and statistically where you're going to have those tornadoes as that part of the storm makes landfall and on the leading edge. And I'll never forget when Hurricane Irma was making landfall here in the Keys in South Florida. We had tornado warning after tornado warning after tornado warning. And for South Florida, that's rare to have so many tornado warnings, but it was all in that leading edge of the spiral band coming in onshore. And not every storm produces as many tornadoes, but it's certainly one of the threats and weapons with a approaching landfalling storm.
Yeah, very great info, and interesting to keep in mind just the geography of a hurricane itself, and those quadrants is something that I typically have to, anytime that a hurricane's approaching and I'm talking to a friend or someone I know that isn't from Florida and might not know, well, the hurricane's going to hit us, I say, oh, it's okay, we're not on the nasty side. And they kind of, oh, it's going to brush us on to the southwest or something. It shouldn't be as bad, but it's interesting to know how that forms and how the different parts of the storm just have different characteristics, typically just based on how those patterns form. Another question. This is from Stephen asking, how do we know about the 25-year cycle, and how is that something that we can predict?
Yeah, well, that was through great research done for many years by a professor who has now passed away. His name was Dr. Gray. And of all places, he did his research at Colorado State University, which doesn't have hurricanes, but he really made a name for himself in looking at decades of data and looking at those factors with the West African monsoon and the water temperatures of the Atlantic. And he gave a lot of attention to what's to call a conveyor belt, if you will. And there's this conveyor belt, if you will, of ocean current and temperature. And we have found that every 25 to 30 years, it kind of flip-flops, if you will. And that flip-flop of that conveyor belt system will then make for change now, salinity and temperature of the water. And that happens every 25 to 30 years. And you can look up his research, Dr. Gray, Colorado State University, on those variables. But they then began to see this correlation of decades where there's more storms and decades where there's fewer storms. Fascinating research. Student working underneath him, Philip Klotzbach, he now is a PhD. He now is taking his research forward. A great guy in trying to help now determine how active a hurricane season might be. And what's interesting, the previous low cycle was, I said this one started in 1995. Well, when you go back to the 60s, 70s, and 80s, when there were fewer storms, it was almost like Florida forgot about hurricanes. And when they did, we saw migration of the population of the United States move from the Rust Belt, states up north, to what we call the Sun Belt, states in the south, because everyone wants to be by the beach, by the ocean, and with warm weather. In that quieter decades, this migration of people. And then, remember I showed you that equation? Our exposure was going up and up and up, all along the coastline of the Gulf, Florida, and the East Coast, the Southeast coast. And then 1995 hit. We flipped the switch, and here came the storms. But now what was different was we have so many more people and buildings in harm's way. In the previous quiet cycle in the 1940s, we had 7 major storms crisscross Florida. In the 1940s, though, how many people lived here? Hardly anyone. And there weren't many buildings. But now you take now to today and you bring in an active season. Things can now change dramatically. And this is where the United States has to now think differently on how they build, where they build and stop that spin cycle now of damage, rebuild, and damage. We have to do it differently, and because of these extreme events, and certainly where we now have added exposure along our coastlines.
Yeah, very good. And I love the risk exposure calculation and map that you showed, because it does get lost a lot of the times when we're looking at the forecast cones and how those things play out, of just what the hurricane itself is actually doing to some of those places. Like 1992, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head how many hurricanes or how active that year was, but I definitely remember Hurricane Andrew here in South Florida. So all it takes is one, and you still have to stay prepared even at any point in that cycle. Follow up to that question from Michael and Libby asking if Dr. Gray's,
Brady,
go ahead.
I just want to mention real quick, I'm glad you mentioned Andrew, because statistically, if you look back at that year, it was a below average season in the below average cycle. But it does tell you that even in the below average cycle and season, it doesn't mean we have zero storms. We still have storms. And we still had that one Category 5. And unfortunately, that one Category 5 didn't spin its wheels in the Atlantic. It came right at South Florida. So each and every hurricane season, regardless of how many storms are predicted, you need to be prepared as if you're the one that's going to get affected. That's one of the overriding preparedness messages. Thanks for bringing that up, Brady. Okay, what's the next question?
Absolutely. So just a couple more questions in here. First one's a follow-up to that previous discussion. This is from Michael and Libby asking if Dr. Gray's studies on the 25-year cycle had already taken warming ocean temperatures into account, and how that might have played into that concept of the cycle.
Great question. So it wasn't so much of warming temperatures. Now, if you're referring now to climate change issues, and now we're looking at data for ocean temperatures rising, he was looking predominantly on how the ocean temperature and salinity would change and flip-flop, if you will, with that conveyor belt. But now, on top of what we see with these cycles of severe weather, now researchers are looking very closely at now climate change issues with seawater temperature and moisture in the atmosphere, and now trying to determine is, okay, was this event or this season now a reflection of what's happening to our climate? And we're starting to see some signals of that already. Moving forward, right now the science community is thinking that moving forward with hurricane seasons, they may be wetter because of more moisture in the atmosphere, move slower, which is not good. They then drop tremendous amounts of flooding rains, and we've seen that in recent years. And they may be a bit more intense because of those rising ocean temperatures and rapid intensification. This year, we saw a huge number of storms rapidly intensify, which is not good and scary, especially if it's approaching a coastline, because people may say, oh, it's just a Category 1 coming. And in 14 hours, it's a Category 3 or 4. And they're like, oh my goodness, they said it was going to be a 1. It's because we cannot predict rapid intensification very accurately. So that's why we have to prepare for every storm, regardless of category, number one. But now, because of moving forward, we're going to see possibly then effects on our hurricane seasons.
Excellent. And yeah, that so many factors go into what forms a hurricane. So there's always more to learn. Here's a great question from Natasha talking about preparedness and the history of Florida and development. How do houses on stilts measure up compared to on the ground terrestrial houses? There's a lot of houses on stilts along the coast here. One of the thinkings behind that was protection from storm surge and hurricanes. So what is your thoughts on the stilt houses?
Yeah, another great question. Thank you for that. And what's really cool is we're working on that question with the wall of wind. So let me explain. So first of all, why are they on stilts or pylons anyway? Well, that's storm surge. Remember that water coming in from the coast? So many communities raise the houses up. You'll see that in the Florida Keys. So first of all, any new home built here in Florida and the Florida Keys and raised up They're built to the highest code in the nation. Now we're looking at it in terms of research because what are those wind loads? What are those forces that are pushing on that structure? Not only with wind on top of those stilts, if you will, but what are the forces of the water slamming into those columns? So we're doing a joint research effort. We're covering the wind aspect at FIU and the Wall of Wind, and at Oregon State University, they have a lab, a big water tank, where they're now looking at the water forces. And that's a research study. We're going to combine the information once it's done, because that can help engineers, architects, and officials across the nation with their building codes. So great question, but if you are going to bring it up higher, there are going to be some additional loading from the wind. So that is certainly being looked at.
All right, I got time for one last question here. This one's from L. So aside from newer building codes, how would you compare Hurricane Andrew to Hurricane Irma? I'm thinking we're talking about in terms of damage and stuff, because Hurricane Irma definitely, like we were saying, especially our part of South Florida, my neighborhood, got several tornadoes.
Yes.
But overall, not, how would we compare that to Andrew, and, how might have those building codes helped with that?
Right. Couple of quick ways to answer that. So first of all, I was in South Florida during Andrew, but I was still doing full-time television, and I was in Fort Myers. And I had driven through Homestead on the way to the Keys before Andrew. So I knew what the area looked like beforehand. Then came Andrew, and we were on the air 24/7, just like all the media, constant coverage of the storm. I was in Fort Myers. We were watching the cone and the track and everything else. And with each successive cone, the track was pushed farther and farther south. It was originally predicted to go through Palm Beach County and exit Fort Myers, but then eventually the track was farther south and went through Homestead. I'll never forget, Brady, going there after the storm with our satellite truck and now doing live reports. And for those of you that were here, for me to see as far as the eye can see, nothing. It's gone. I had never seen anything like that before, and a visual memory I'll never forget. And you can imagine the folks that rode out Andrew, talk to some of the local residents. Their stories are just amazing on what they heard, what they saw when they rode out Andrew. But back then in '92, we did have a building code, but it wasn't as strong as today's, and enforcement. Remember that equation I put? Exposure is the amount of buildings, but vulnerabilities has to do with building codes, but inspection and enforcement. And if you have bad building practices, and in some neighborhoods they were not built to the code that they even had. Then comes Irma. I went to a meeting in Marathon. There was a meeting with the governor and all the local officials for the Keys. And so I was curious as I drove down to that meeting several days after Irma. I was curious now, okay, how are the Keys going to look? And so I started obviously through Key Largo, made myself to Marathon. But once done with the meeting, I said, I'm going to drive down to Cujo Key where it made landfall. And here's my observations. I was pleasantly surprised. What do I mean by that? Building codes work. The Keys did not look like Homestead after Andrew. The Keys had buildings that were left standing. It wasn't complete devastation. Now there was certainly storm surge that came through that affected the homes and businesses. But the damage you saw in the Keys was that older construction. Remember that picture I showed you of the newer home flanked by two older homes? It was all that older stuff that got destroyed. And of course, the perception is there was damage everywhere, and because of the media, and I know that because I worked in the media, when a television crew goes down to a damaged area like the Keys, are they going to set up their camera in front of a new home that has very little damage? Or are they going to set up in their camera in front of an old mobile home that's like a tin can that's totally destroyed? Because what looks more visual on TV? Well, It's that destroyed mobile home. And the perception is, oh my gosh, the keys are gone. Well, that was not the case. And I only saw one reporter that actually took his camera and panned from that old mobile home and panned to a home right next door that was new and it's standing and looks great, and made the point. Here in Florida, our building codes are the strongest, but it's the example for the rest of the country of what we need to do. All coastal states, you would think all of them have the same building codes. Unfortunately, they do not. And we're trying to now educate with research in the Wall of Wind at FIU to change that narrative so that all communities can be more resilient.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that and everything else, Erik. We are just about out of time. I just put that link in the chat again. If you'd like to learn more, at that link is our 12-part video series, the Museum of Discovery and Science and Erik Salna at the Extreme Events Institute and International Hurricane Research Center at Florida International University helped us produce this spring. Everything you could need to know about hurricanes with some fun little experiments and demonstrations from me and the team here. A lot of fun putting that together, a lot of fun doing this. Definitely come back and join us on Saturday, May 15th for the return of our Eye of the Storm event to get you ready for everything you need to know for this hurricane season. Hopefully it's a little bit more mellow than last hurricane season all around. And enjoy the video series and this. And thank you again to our guest, Erik Salna, Associate Director of Education and Outreach at International Hurricane Research Center at FIU. And come down to the museum, try your hand at our own miniature Wall of Wind, and visit our Storm Center for more information on all things hurricanes and some information about Hurricane Andrew as well. We'll be here with you, and stay tuned to our website and mailing lists for information on upcoming Distinguished Speaker Series events. We'll be returning with those shortly, but glad to have our friend Erik on with us for this special edition.
Thank you, Brady. I appreciate the opportunity. For all of you listening, certainly I hope you enjoyed it. And I want a big quick plug for the video series too. As you mentioned, Brady, it's not just the science, but really cool science demonstrations at mods that coincide with each particular topic. And we had each expert talk about their passion for their job, their STEM career, and it was fascinating to hear why they became a meteorologist. For example, Ken Graham, the director of the National Hurricane Center. So lots of great information in those videos. And Brady, you are a big part of that too on those demonstrations. Thank you. Thank you all for the opportunity. Thank you very much.
All right. Brady Newbill, Museum of Discovery and Science here, signing off. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you again next time.